Hi, everyone. My name is Becky Robinson, and I'm so looking forward to having a conversation with you today and welcoming our special guest, Richard Seaman. Hi, Richard. How are you today?
Hi, Becky. Doing well, thank you.
Sure. So as everyone's coming in, I hope you'll take a quick moment and find the chat. As we always do in these weekly connection sessions, we want to invite you to put your questions and your comments and engage with us in the chat. And when you do that, what we want to ask is that you would use the drop-down menu to select all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see your comments. Now, I know that Dick is calling in today from his home in the Worcester area of Ohio. So we'd love to know where you're calling in from today. Hi, Erica in North Carolina. I am in my loft in Michigan, as you probably already know. And as we've been doing on the Daily Connection, I want to ask you the daily prompt, which is, what are you grateful for? And we would love to hear from you in the chat about what you're grateful for today. Thank you, Erica. You're grateful for first responders. That is something good to be grateful for. Dick, what are you grateful for today?
Well, I'm grateful to be able to have an opportunity to talk with everybody, and Becky, to share some thoughts, some questions that you might have. So it's just a pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. So welcome to John in Southwest PA, who's grateful for time with family, to William in Minneapolis, grateful for spring, to Jane, whose son was born 44 years ago, maybe today. Happy birthday to your son. Kristen, who's grateful for an upcoming job interview in Columbia, Missouri. And welcome to Joanne in California. Dick, I might not have mentioned this to you, but we've been doing these sessions. We were doing them on a daily basis up until last week, and now we've just switched to weekly. And so many of the folks who are calling in have been here with me each day. So welcome to Denise. Denise is grateful for the Weaving Influence team. That's very kind. And Alejandra, she is grateful for this different time to know different points of view. So thank you to all of you who have joined, and we're going to get started with our content in just a few minutes. But before we do that, I want to take a moment to introduce Dick Seaman to you. Dick and I met through a common connection in Ohio. And we met because of Dick's book, which is called A Vibrant Vision, The Entrepreneurship of Multi-Generational Family Business. Can you show us the book? I had the pleasure of reading the book, and when I did, one of the things that really stood out to me that I appreciated was the way that Dick shared some of the highlights and the challenges of his journey as a family business owner. So Dick is currently the chairman of the Seaman Corporation, and he was the CEO there from 1976 to 2015, assuming leadership of the business after his father passed away at the young age of 55. And under Dick's leadership, Seaman Corporation has grown from 10 million to 200 million in revenue. And as the owner of a much, much smaller business than that, I was inspired in reading Dick's book by the many challenges that he faced and the courage that it took to lead the company where it has grown. So Dick, I hope that's helpful in terms of an introduction. I'll also say that Dick has been married for many years, has amazing kids and grandkids, and it's been really fun to get to know you.
Thank you, Becky. We might just add that the business is an industrial fabrics business. It's a business that my father started with 2 sewing machines in the basement, sewing fringe around baby doll diapers. And as you mentioned, he unfortunately passed away at the age of 55 in 1978. So we've been working in the business and growing it to where it's become a large industrial fabrics business that produces fabrics for truck tarps, single ply roofing, military applications. We ship fabrics all over the world. And I'm always pleased to say we ship fabrics into China instead of importing them from China.
Thank you so much for providing more info. So for those of you who might want to share your learning today on Twitter, you can use the hashtag #weeklyconnection, and we would love to hear your thoughts. So Dick, as we dive in today, we want to talk a little bit about this whole idea of multi-generational family business and the value that family business can bring in the world. And specifically at this time of global crisis and uncertainty, I'm wondering what people in business of any sizes can learn from what you and family business might already know.
Well, I think multi-generational family businesses provide 2 things. One, a great sense of hope, and also a sense of stability. While this pandemic really seems to be a major thing, and it is for around the world, multi-generational businesses by their very nature have faced these sort of what I call unknown tsunamis that hit every decade or two. If you think about companies that have been around more than 100 years, they've gone through a couple of world wars, they've gone through the Great Depression. Our own business, which is 70 years old, 7 decades, in that time period, we've gone through the oil crisis of the 1970s, interest rates that were in the 18 to 20% range, the impact of 9/11, the financial crisis of 2008. So while this one is different, it's just another unknown economic impact on us. And again, multi-generational family businesses have learned that by staying true to your values and to your long-term plans and perspectives, this too shall pass. We will weather this in some form or the other.
So that's a really powerful lesson that you're drawing from having faced crises in the past, looking ahead to not only just the short-term goals that you might have for your organization, but the long-term as well, and remembering this too shall pass. That's really helpful. And sorry about that, Dick. So I'm curious, you mentioned that Seaman Corporation is 70 years old, so there are a number of crises that you weathered. Could you reflect for us on some of the potentially difficult decisions that you had to make at some of those other junctures that your organization has lived through and survived?
Well, I think the 2008 financial crisis is a good example of how we've navigated our way through that, and also the role that the strategic planning process that we have in our businesses has enabled us to do these kinds of things. When we hit the 2008 financial crisis, it really hit the entire economy around the world very suddenly, not unlike this pandemic that we're dealing with. And what we noticed to begin with was that things were going to be different. We recognized it early on while it was happening. It wasn't something we thought was just going to occur over a couple of weeks and then we'd be back to normal. So we were able to make decisions early on around the impact that we saw, but we didn't make major decisions around our strategic objectives. What we wanted to do was wait and see how this 2008 economic financial crisis unfolded and what it meant both to us and to our customers. What we recognized is when we came out of this, we were going to come out looking differently than what we did before. A lot of companies I saw just sort of went into a holding pattern, and they just thought, well, we'll just weather this and then things will be back to, quote, the normal that it was used to be. As a result of that, they didn't make decisions quickly enough that they should have. And then when they made decisions, they would make decisions such as, well, we're going to have a 10% cut on all expenses across all departments. What that does is it keeps you from moving forward with your strategic objectives. In our situation, we step back and we say, okay, we're going to look differently, but how does that impact what our overall strategic objectives are? We might have to adjust them a little bit. And then we may have to reduce costs in areas that aren't going to be significant to us when we come out of this. But let's not take away or pull back on the investments that are going to be important to us when we come out of this. So by having a plan like that, we were able to make those kinds of decisions, which allowed us to rebound very, very quickly from the economic crisis. In fact, within about 12 months, we were back on our plan, despite the fact that this crisis went through for really several years on a lot of companies.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about this approach that you and Seaman Corporation have taken to strategic planning. I'm wondering if you can give us some insights into how leaders in organizations can make strategic planning an organizational priority.
We were fortunate that in the early 80s, we became familiar with what strategic planning was all about. And it's like a lot of business processes. There were a lot of buzzwords about it around strategic planning. There were a lot of consultants that showed up, many of which really I don't think were that effective in strategic planning. It takes a leadership from the top to recognize the value of strategic planning and to stay committed to it on a multi-year basis. Really, it's not about the plan that you put together. And I can give examples of companies or institutions that would do these strategic plans. They would be 5-year plans, and then they wouldn't revisit the process until they went through the 3rd or 4th or 5th year of that particular plan. I've always said that strategic planning is not about the plan, it's about the process that you go through. And when you go through an appropriate process, which is the basics of the planning process, where you're looking at what your strengths and weaknesses are, when you're looking at what your business environment is and how that environment might change what you're doing. You've got to do that on an annual basis because those dynamics change almost every year, particularly in today's day and age. So as you put that plan together, it's really more about the way you bring your management team together, the important people that are going to run your business, and you get their ideas, you get their input, you develop a plan, and then you all go out and execute it together. But because you've got that plan and because you're revisiting it every year, you're able to pick up on the nuances or the changes that are happening in your business and how you need to adjust and change accordingly. And that has to do with capital investments that you want to make. It certainly has to do with the human capital investments that you want to make, because it's the human capital that you have that's your most important asset that's going to help you execute on your strategic plan and objectives.
So Dick, I wonder at times of crisis like this, if leaders may be tempted to put aside the strategic planning, and focus on surviving. So what might you say about the danger of letting go of a yearly process around strategic planning? And what are you and Seaman doing this year as it relates to continuing your process of strategic planning?
Well, it's very tempting to do that because it's an easy thing to say, well, the plan doesn't make any sense now because the whole world has changed on us at this point in time. In 2008, just as it is now, we were just finishing up on our strategic planning process. Our planning process runs for about 6 months, and it ends up at mid-year. So we have the balance of our budget year that we have to finish at this stage of the game. And so now we have the strategic plan. We can easily say that strategic plan we put together is not going to unfold the way we thought it was. But that doesn't mean that we put it on the shelf or we cast it aside and we put all of our focus on trying to deal with the tactical challenges that are in front of us right now. What it means is that we start thinking about what the world's going to look like post-pandemic, whenever that may be. But you stop and think about, okay, if we got a vaccine tomorrow and it was available to everybody, certainly things would start coming back to normal. But this pandemic has caused us to do things such as work from home more frequently. How are those kind of things going to affect our business model going forward? And how is that going to relate to the strategic objectives that we had out there? Maybe some of them aren't valid. If they're not, then we need to make shifting in that. But we will be starting this cycle again in about 6 months. We're going to have a lot more information at that stage of the game. The failure to stay committed to that planning process, not the plan per se, but the process, the failure to do that will cause you to make wrong decisions, I think, or less than optimum decisions, and also cause you to perhaps miss opportunities for making adjustments to your business and to your business model. The best example today, I think, and the most obvious one, are restaurants. They've got to change, and those restaurants that have survived certainly have built, in many ways, a good takeout service, for example, to keep things going. Well, their new business model will recognize that not only will they start their restaurant business again, but they're going to have a customer base out there that really enjoys stopping by and picking up fine dining and taking it home. So that can be an adjunct to their business and grow their business in the future. That's just again, a kind of a more obvious example of how you can take what's going on today, recognize that this is not the condition we're going to have forever. There
Mhm.
will be a new normal out there. What's that going to look like, and how's that going to affect our business and our business model?
Sure, that's really helpful, Dick. And I assume that there are many of those restaurant businesses that you're referencing that are more multi-generational or family business centered.
They are, and a lot of them though are still just first generation, and but they are already starting to think about what is their business going to look like when we come out of this pandemic.
So I'm going to go a little bit off script, although first I want to go to Denise's comment. So Denise is mentioning that her brother owns a restaurant and has completely needed to change his business model, but is doing very well and will operate differently going forward. As someone who has eaten at Denise's brother's restaurant and enjoyed the delicious lasagna that he makes, I imagine people are enjoying taking that food home, Denise. So, maybe you could share this broadcast or Dick's book with your brother. So I'm going to go off script a little bit, Dick, and I would love to hear your point of view on, what the value is of an entrepreneur choosing a path toward multi-generation or family legacy or family business rather than kind of the current mindset where entrepreneurs want to build their companies toward a liquid exit being acquired or, somehow taken over by a bigger company. Talk to me about the value and the value at times like these in having a different mindset toward the entrepreneurial journey.
Well, that's a very good question, Becky, and certainly multifaceted in many ways. In reality, it's one of the primary reasons I wrote my book, because when I retired as the CEO and sort of the day-to-day responsibilities at Seaman Corporation, and I started reflecting back on my career and entrepreneurship in general, I'm involved in entrepreneurship on a number of levels. I'm on the board of an organization called the Morgan Foundation that provides funding for entrepreneurship. I was involved in the Ohio Third Frontier Commission for the state of Ohio, where we were providing grants to startup companies and to support the entrepreneurial ecosystem and innovation. And my concern was that the only model we were teaching were to entrepreneurs was to create a business plan and have an exit strategy to that. And to look for funding, sort of the Shark Tank approach, develop your pitch and go out there and get funding. And that was disturbing to me because I think, first of all, while we showcase companies that have been very successful, most of those Silicon Valley kind of companies are pretty rare that are successful. Secondly, I think there's sort of a greater calling that if you are thinking about building a business from a legacy standpoint that you want to have survive you and pass on to future generations, you'll make strategic decisions differently. You'll make them more for the long term than for the short term, whether that's concern about going public and what are your short-term earnings going to be, or whether it has to do with what you have to show in the short term to get additional funding down the road. So I'm not saying that isn't good, because I think a lot of innovation needs that kind of venture capital to support it and keep it going. But I certainly think a different model should also be taught, because I think that there's a lot of future entrepreneurs out there that would like to think about how do we build a business that will last for several generations. Those kind of companies, essentially, as I say, have a great deal more stability to them. Many of them are more connected with their communities, so they can provide a lot of support to the community when you go through times like we have right now. A lot of our local businesses are providing philanthropic support to our communities here. So there's just, I call it a greater calling, if you will. It's a long-term view, a very long-term view, but it's in contrast to what we call the serial entrepreneur who starts a business and sells a business. And it pays more homage, I think, to the constituencies of your business, whether that's your customers, whether it's your employees, or whether it's your communities.
That's really helpful, Dick. So let's talk for a few moments about any advice that you might have for business owners or leaders, who are struggling with the sequestering of self-quarantine. What recommendations do you have for leaders as we navigate the challenges of the next several weeks and months? And what guidance can you give us about how to think creatively about having this experience, challenging as it may be, to drive us forward to greater success in the future?
Well, it's hard to come up with advice that's good for everybody because, depending on how long your business has been established and where you are in your business or your entrepreneurship activity that you're doing, depends on how focused you have to be on just surviving at this point. And of course, that's what everybody is trying to do is to survive. Around the survival side of it is certainly financial, the cash flow implications of what's happening right now, probably the most critical part of it. That and how you retain your human capital so that you've got your people that you need when you come out of this. But I think the first thing to do is to look at the human capital and look at your financial resources. We are fortunate that our government has stepped forth, and there's a number of programs, whether it's the payroll protection program or loan programs that enable you to support your human capital component for some period of time here. So that's good. Once you've got that in place, then I really think you've got to force yourself to thinking long term. And as I was saying before, it's not hard to imagine that a year from today, things will certainly look differently than what they do today. Hopefully converge back to what we think is going to be the new normal. But what will that look like? And how might we take advantage of that in our business today and start thinking about how to make those kind of things happen? So it's a time for sort of creative innovation that has to continue to drive entrepreneurship there. And there's no question there's a lot of future opportunities out there. Even, in our own situation, virtually all of our salaried people, which is well over 100, are working from home. Well, how much of that work could continue from home when this is over? But then again, how much of it has to, again, be face-to-face? When do we bring these people back together again? Because Zoom meetings don't cover everything. There is something lost from the face-to-face, person-to-person contact. But, if you have a business and you're thinking about that, think about what's the benefits of both sides of those, and how are you going to restructure your work processes for your management team when you come out of this?
That's really helpful. So for those of you who are listening, I'm curious, what have you experienced as it relates to some of these considerations for what work looks like after the crisis? So if you're someone who's traditionally worked in an office, are you hearing these conversations about what does life look like after this? We'd love to hear your comments or questions in the chat if you have anything that you'd like Dick to cover. Dick, I'm curious, you mentioned restaurants as one industry that has been forced into some new ways of operating to survive. I'm curious, based on your involvement with the entrepreneurial community, what other creative innovations you've seen so far during this pandemic?
Well, this isn't necessarily entrepreneurship, but the one that I'm close to and really am watching carefully has to do with colleges and universities. Their business models have been totally upset in this process, and that's a group of institutions that I know are thinking really hard about what they're going to look like afterwards. But they're being forced to make changes and to ask the kinds of questions that perhaps they should have asked a decade ago at this point. And I don't know what the answer is there. I think there's great opportunities there, but I think the consumer's going to change a great deal. They're learning a lot online by being at home and having college content delivered to them. On the other hand, they're missing the interaction at a personal level. So how are they going to balance that? And more importantly, what kind of value do they believe they're getting that they're going to be willing to pay for at this point? Because pricing models, certainly at private institutions, just have been inconsistent and unsustainable with what the reality of the world is out there. So I think they're going to be impacted by this, in a great way. Again, I think most businesses will have learned how to use technology better, how to be more efficient from a travel standpoint. But again, trying to decide, where do you need these person-to-person kind of interactions, and where do you make those investments that will give you and your business a competitive advantage over your other competitors in that marketplace? Certainly customer relationships are going to be looked at very, very closely, because we haven't been able to have the same kind of contact. But I think how we've used technology to retain good interaction and contact with our customers is going to build relationships that will sustain themselves after this pandemic.
So we have a question from Celeste, Dick, and she's wondering how your sales teams have adapted. Do you have any insight to how the sales teams at Seaman are changing with the crisis?
Well, certainly they're not having that face-to-face interaction, but they can continue both Zoom meetings with customers and a lot of proactive telephone call conversations with them. It's important for them to know that we're still here, we're still interested in their needs, we're still up and running, fortunately, because we're an essential industry. And how can we best provide them the products and services that they need to keep their businesses running in this time period?
Got it.
So I think in many ways, it's, they're still working just as hard as they did. They're just working a little differently, probably missing the face-to-face, I'm sure. Fortunately, our customers understand that, and I think they will be more appreciative and have a lot more gratitude for proactive reaching out that's being done on the part of our sales teams.
Thanks, Dick. So a lot of comments in the chat about, people who obviously we're all working from home right now, but kind of pros and cons, and this realization that the crisis has proven that work can be done at home. And so then people might think, well, why shouldn't it be? But Dick, I think your point to, what competitive advantage can we gain when we are able to work in person? What additional value is there from people working in person? And then a few comments here about, knowing that when people return to the office, the rules will be different, fewer people potentially rotating schedules, that kind of thing. So it's so hard to see what's coming.
Yeah. No, I think fewer people and again, rotating shifts is true, but if you get vaccines, that's not going to be required, if, we go over from that standpoint. However, I do think trying to understand where work can be done at home that allows your staff to get a better balance of work-life balance there with the family, and how you incorporate that into the way in which you manage your workforces will be very important and give you a competitive edge in terms of trying to get human capital.
Well, that's
However,
true.
I would also say that I think creativity and innovation is really hard to do if you don't have face-to-face. We used to talk about the kinds of things that got done in hallway conversations that you had just because you came across each other. The dynamics of that kind of creativity and innovation around processes or products or services are much more difficult to do remotely than in person. And so I just would urge companies to think about how you balance that.
Well, I miss my whiteboards, I got to tell you. I suppose I could bring them home, but it's not the same as gathering around the whiteboard and brainstorming together. So I definitely agree with you. There's something magical about those face-to-face interactions. Celeste has another question for you. She's wondering how you think travel budgets will be leveraged moving forward. So companies that are used to investing in travel, do you think that will come back? What thoughts do you have?
Well, I would imagine that travel will be targeted more rather than shotgun. I mean, I think there'll be a realization that you can get a lot of work done without having to send people to different locations. And we will leverage these technology platforms that we currently have and that are being developed certainly much more effectively. But again, I don't think it's going to replace all of the interaction that you have face to face with people. And those companies, again, that can balance that uh, and leverage the effectiveness using technology platforms, but balance that with the face to face relationship building with customers, are the ones that I think are going to have competitive advantages going down the road.
Sure, that's super helpful. And I know, Dick, just on a personal level, we did meet in person a couple of times, and it's not something that you can recreate on Zoom for sure.
No, you can't. You can't. Right.
So we are just about out of time. And Dick, I want to make sure that we give people information about how they can stay in touch with you. And I know that Kelly put in the chat your LinkedIn profile so people can connect with you. Also, Dick has a brand new website. I'm proud to say that Weaving Influence partnered with Dick on that new website. It's richardnseaman.com. And we would invite you to find out more about Dick and his work by visiting the new website. And then I would also encourage you, Dick, can you show us the book again, to check out Dick's book. It is available on Amazon, both in a hardcover like he's holding and a Kindle version. And we would encourage you to check out the book, particularly, you know, if you are interested in entrepreneurship or family business, or if you know someone who might benefit from the book. I personally couldn't put it down, and learned so much from many areas that Dick covers in the book. So we encourage you to get all those. We do have an hour-long webinar available tomorrow that requires registration on the topic of team conflict. So we'd love to have you join. And Dick, I'm going to kick it back to you for some parting wisdom or encouragement for this group today.
Well, first of all, I appreciate having the time with you and with all your friends, Becky, here. Secondly, I think what I would say is I would encourage you to purchase the book, not just because I wrote it, but not only does it talk about family business and multi-generational businesses, it talks about how to grow businesses. And that's where it, I think, has a unique benefit, because it's not just about growing a business for growth's sake, but it's growing it for a legacy and multi-generational purposes. And as I said earlier, you make different decisions when that becomes your objective.